I'm Iodo, and welcome to what is probably part 5 of making an Iron Hills mining belt. And I think we need some better lighting in here. That's better. I knew I forgot something. Now I'm hoping that this is going to be the last part of this video, because really all I've got left to do is the finishing touches. Now this is what I have so far. And the first step will be to punch the holes in the belt so that it works. And then the second step will be to make a back piece for it, just like this one. Except I'm going to do it much less fancy and a little bit wider so that it's got more of a utility purpose. Now my idea with this is it's actually incredibly useful, because if you put a belt pouch on there or a knife or something, it can't slide around because it's trapped between the little tabs on the back piece. Now what I thought would be even better is if this was wide enough for holes to be punched around the edge of it, so that you can tie things on if you need to, so that you can have more of a useful variable piece of kit. So it's a bit of an experiment like most of my projects. Now in order to make that, I've got a big piece of slightly thinner than the belt. I think it's about half the thickness, it's only a 2mm leather, and it's completely undyed. So I'm going to have to dye the leather. Now that does give me an advantage. It means that I'm going to be making it wet, and that means that I get the chance to wet form it. So in order to make the slots, instead of riveting on a section like I've done on this one, what I'm going to do is cut 2 slots in it and then wet form that into a little bit which sticks out. So it's a bit difficult to explain, but you'll see what I mean. And with any luck, it'll be successful. Okay, let's get to it then. So I think I recall having said that the first step would be to punch holes in the belt. Now in between my last video clip and this, I have marked out the holes along here. So what I'll be doing is I'll be using the 4.5mm hole size, because it needs to be a good little bit bigger than the size of the bar on the belt buckle, because otherwise it usually ends up getting a little bit tight. So there is honestly no science to this. You've just got to make sure that it's centered on the dot. What I find is it helps to just press it a little bit and make a tiny indentation and then take the tool away, so that you can check that the circle is directly over the dot that you've drawn and not to one side, and that way you usually get a better centered hole. Now I will check that that actually works before I punch any more at that size. Yep, that seems to be fine. Okay, that looks like it'll just about do it. Now the next step would be to design a pattern for the back piece. Just for a point of comparison, I'll give you a better view of the previous one that I've made. And the next one that I'll be making won't be using rivets or extra tabs put over the top, it'll just be using slots cut in the leather underneath. And I'm hoping the new one that I will be making out of the new piece of leather will wear a bit better than this one has, because the leather had an artificial finish which was quite thick put on it when it was new. So that's ended up with lots of cracks in it. Probably can't see that, but it has anyway. So I'm hoping that self-dyed veg tan leather will fare a little bit better. And my camera's running out of batteries, if I haven't said so already. Alright, new day, new camera batteries, and time to finish the plan. So, this is going to be my backing piece, and I don't know if you can see the pencil lines on here on the camera. I'm hoping that you can. But my plan is to cut 2 slots next to each other, and then it will make a loop that the belt can go through. So my first step would be to punch holes there, and then my second step would be to cut between them on both sides. I did make a pattern out of cardboard to check that it would work, just a random piece of packaging from something. But what I've done is I've punched 2 holes at both ends and then cut a slot, and then done that twice. And I've used trial and error to make it so that the buckle only just fits through, because once that's threaded through it won't need taking off many times. But so long as it fits, it's all good. So it'll look like that. So I think what I'm going to do is use the biggest hole on the belt punch to make it easier to cut the slots out. But the first step is to cut out the shape. Now, as you saw on my previous video of leatherwork with cutting, the number of mistakes that I made, I am hoping I'm going to make less mistakes this time, because undyed leather is much easier to mark out than dyed leather, so at least I can see my lines. Here goes. The tripod is now getting in the way of my workbench. Alright, so the next step that I'm going to do is cut the lines across there. Now, it might be worth mentioning just this little trick, because obviously I'm holding the knife at an angle. If I cut from there and I keep going all the way to there, there's a chance that I can nick this side of the hole. So what I'll be doing is I'll be cutting from there to the middle and then cutting from the other side to the middle, and that way I should get clean edges with no chance of slipping. Just prevents messy mistakes. Okay, so now that's done, the next step is to use that tool again to round off the edges, just the same as I did on the belt parts of the project. Alright, so now it's time to make a lot more mess. Time to do the dyeing. Now, the first thing I'll show you, I've just cut 4 blocks of random wood. I have no idea what these used to be, it was just in my scrap box. They are the same width as that buckle, So when it comes to wet forming, I'll be able to use that to push the loops out so that it's easier to thread the belt through. And the other thing I'm going to mention, anything with leather dye, it never comes off anything, so always cover your benches in plastic. Now the first step of this is to make the leather wet. If you were just dyeing the leather, you wouldn't have to make it completely wet. You just have to wipe it over with a wet cloth first to help the dye to run. But because I'm wet forming, I'm going to be making it completely wet. So that is like very slightly warm water. So I'm just going to put that in and leave it for all of the air to come out. So while that's happening, I'll be using Fibing's dark brown leather dye, but I don't actually want it to be dark brown. I actually want it to be a little bit lighter than that. So I'll be watering down the dye a bit. So I find the best way to do that is to just get a little tub of water of how much dye you think you might be using, and then you get the dye dabber and you make sure that that's fully wet, and then you just transfer that straight into the little tub of water, and then it's surprising how much dye that transfers over, and that is plenty dark enough for me, I think, and it should be enough. Just have to not spill it, really not spill it. Lots of tissue. So I don't want this to be dripping wet, I just want it to be soaked on the inside, so I'll drain it off and then dry it off on the outside. And it's gone nice and soft now, so I can make the shape. Honestly, that's probably a little bit too on the wet side for wet forming, but by the time I've painted the dye on it, it will have drained down a bit. Move that out of the way. Get rid of the tissue. It's also worth mentioning that my dye is water-based, and making the leather wet helps water-based dye to run, but I have no idea what the procedure is for oil-based dye, so it might be worth checking what yours is. As a matter of course, I always do the edges first. Yep, that looks like a nice colour.